At Voidwatch, we tell stories the way they deserve to be told. No generated voices, no synthetic narration, just a human reading words that matter. If that's what you're here for, subscribe. My name is Theo. Let's begin. The Varath Medical Institute's main lecture hall was built to inspire awe, and it succeeded. The ceiling arched 50 meters overhead in a series of interlocking curves that the Varath called the helix form, their architectural tribute to the double strand of RNA that they considered the fundamental unit of all life worth studying. The walls were lined with preserved specimens, thousands of them, every known category of biological organism, mounted or suspended in stasis fields behind panels of treated glass. It was, in the opinion of most species who visited, the most comprehensive collection of biological knowledge in the settled galaxy. Dr. Senna Vasquez sat in the third row from the back, where the seating had been modified slightly to accommodate a humanoid frame. The Varath had not originally included humans in their architectural calculations when the lecture hall was built. The standard seats were designed for beings with 3 articulated limbs and a lower center of gravity, which meant that Senna's options were to perch awkwardly on a Varath seat or use the modified bench the Institute had installed after 3 human students had fallen off the standard seats in a single semester. She used the bench. She had a certain practical relationship with the limits of design. She was here as a fellow, not a student, technically, though the distinction felt increasingly academic the longer she sat in lectures where she was the only one taking notes by hand. The Varath recorded everything directly through their sensory organs, a biological capability that meant note-taking was considered a somewhat primitive habit, like using a stick to move food toward your mouth when you had perfectly functional limbs. Senna kept taking notes anyway. Old habits from medical school died hard, and besides, the act of writing helped her think. At the lectern, Director Kaveth of the Varath Xenobiology Division was concluding the portion of the lecture that Senna had been quietly dreading since she read the syllabus 3 weeks ago. Kaveth was, by every measure the Institute possessed, the foremost authority on cellular repair mechanisms in the settled galaxy. Her monograph on comparative wound response had been cited more times than any other paper in the Institute's 200-year history. She was also, Senna had come to understand, operating from a foundational assumption that no one in the Varath academic tradition had ever seriously questioned, because no one in the Varath academic tradition had ever had a reason to. The display above the lectern showed a detailed cellular diagram, a cross-section of tissue response to what the Varath classified as Category 7 biological damage, the kind of trauma that their models predicted would be lethal to any organic system within a narrow window of time, if not treated with specific interventions. "The data is unambiguous," Kaveth said, her voice carrying the precise harmonic modulation the Varath used to signal that they were presenting established fact rather than hypothesis. "Cellular systems subjected to Category 7 damage cannot initiate effective autonomous repair without external biochemical support. The cascade failure begins within minutes. Without intervention, systemic collapse follows." She gestured at the diagram, and a new image appeared. A timeline rendered in stark red, showing the deterioration curve. "Every species we have studied confirms this pattern. The biological laws governing cellular repair are universal. They do not bend for individual organisms, and they do not bend for species." She paused, and in the pause Senna recognized the specific quality of silence that preceded an example being made. "You will note," Kaveth continued, "that the Concordance Medical Database includes a filing from the Sol System's human representative claiming recovery rates from Category 7 damage that our models classify as statistically impossible without intervention. We have reviewed this data thoroughly." She tilted her head in the slight angle that, among Varath, indicated polite dismissal. "We believe the human medical classification system uses different parameters for what constitutes Category 7 damage. The claim is not that humans recover from such injuries. The claim reflects a definitional discrepancy. A core fellow in the front raised a limb. Director, the human records include surgical imagery and recovery documentation. Kaveth's response was gentle, the way a teacher is gentle when correcting a student who means well but has misunderstood something fundamental. Medicine, she said, is a precise science. Precision requires consistent definitions. Until human injury classification is independently verified against Varath standards, we must rely on the data we can confirm. The biology of cellular repair does not produce exceptions. Senna set her pen down on her notes. She had known this moment was coming. She had read the syllabus. She had read Kaveth's published work. She had, over 3 months at the Institute, grown familiar with the specific way the Varath handled human data that didn't fit their models, the polite, precise, absolute certainty that the anomaly must lie in the human measurement, never in the model. She had decided 3 weeks ago that she was not going to let it pass again. She raised her hand. "Director Kaveth," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I believe I can provide independent verification of the human data, not through documentation, through direct observation." Kaveth turned toward her, and the entire lecture hall turned with her, the slow, unified movement of several hundred Varath students redirecting their attention to the human in the third row. There was no hostility in it. Senna knew that much by now. The Varath were not cruel. They were simply very, very certain. "Dr. Vasquez," Kaveth said, her tone carrying the same gentle precision. "Direct observation of a single case cannot supersede population-level data. The scientific method requires reproducible results across controlled conditions." "I understand," Senna said. "That's why I'm proposing a controlled demonstration. Your institute has a biological stress laboratory. I've reviewed its specifications. It's capable of producing Category 7 trauma under controlled conditions with full monitoring." She kept her voice level, the way she had learned to keep it in the emergency department when everything was going wrong, and the only useful thing she could do was be the calmest voice in the room. "I would like to be the subject. I would like your institute's independent monitors, your equipment, and your documentation protocols. And I would like to demonstrate, under your own standards of evidence, what human cellular repair actually looks like." The silence that followed was the kind Senna had learned to read over 3 months. Not hostile, not dismissive. Processing. The Varath were exceptionally good at processing. Director Kaveth was quiet for what felt like a long time. When she spoke, the harmonic modulation in her voice had shifted slightly. The register the Varath used when they were genuinely uncertain how to classify a situation. "Dr. Vasquez, you are proposing to voluntarily subject yourself to Category 7 biological trauma. Correct. In the full understanding that our models predict non-survivable systemic cascade failure without immediate intervention. I understand your models predict that, yes." Kaveth's head tilted again, but this time the angle was different, the angle the Varath used when they were recalibrating rather than dismissing. "And you believe the outcome will differ?" "I know the outcome will differ," Senna said. A ripple moved through the hall, the low harmonic murmur of several hundred Varath students processing something outside their existing frameworks. A senior fellow near the front spoke. "Director, human medical claims have been categorized as unverified. If we submit a fellow to this procedure and the models prove accurate, we would be responsible for the death of a concordance member species representative." There was a pause that felt heavier than it should have. Then Kaveth spoke again, and her voice had acquired the particular quality it took on when she was making an official pronouncement rather than offering an opinion. "The Institute's Biological Ethics Board will review the proposal. If approved, we will conduct the demonstration under full monitoring with our senior trauma team present and intervention available at the subject's request. She looked at Senna directly, the full focused attention of eyes that had spent 60 years examining things too small and too complex for most minds to hold. "Dr. Vasquez, you are certain of this?" "I am," Senna said. Kavath was quiet for one more moment. "The ethics board will convene this afternoon," she said. "We will have an answer by tomorrow." The Varath Biological Stress Laboratory occupied the lowest level of the Institute's research wing, a deliberate placement that the Institute's founders had considered appropriate for a space dedicated to examining the limits of living systems. The ceiling was low by the standards of the upper floors, the lighting calibrated to the precise spectrum the Varath had determined was optimal for biological observation, which was slightly bluer than Senna found comfortable and made her skin look faintly wrong in the mirrors she had been careful not to look at too directly. The room smelled of the disinfectant compound the Varath used universally, something that Senna's nose had eventually processed as almost pleasant after 3 months, the way you eventually stopped smelling your own shampoo. It was, she thought, a very clean room in which to do a very uncomfortable thing. She had spent the previous evening doing what she always did before a procedure she was uncertain about, which was reviewing the physiology she already knew from a slightly different angle, looking for the gaps in her own understanding, the places where confidence might be overstepping the actual evidence. She had found a few. She had not found any that changed her fundamental assessment. The Varath models were built on data from species whose cellular repair mechanisms genuinely did not match human biology. They had never been wrong about any species they had actually studied. They had simply never studied a species whose evolutionary history looked like humanity's. She had not slept particularly well. This was, she had decided on her way to the laboratory that morning, entirely reasonable. Director Kavath was already present when Senna arrived, along with 4 members of the Institute's senior research team and what appeared to be the entirety of the ethics board, who had decided collectively that the appropriate place to be during this demonstration was the room where it was happening, rather than a comfortable observation suite several floors above. Senna had been told this was unusual. She had chosen to take it as a compliment. 2 trauma intervention specialists stood near the wall, their equipment ready, their posture carrying the specific quality of attention that Senna recognized from her own years in emergency medicine, the focused readiness of people who hoped they would not need to act, but had prepared as if they would. The monitoring array was, she had to admit, extraordinary. The Varath biological monitoring systems made the best human hospital equipment look approximate. The suite of sensors surrounding the procedure table could track individual cellular responses in real time, measure biochemical cascade events as they occurred, and produce a complete data record that would be, she knew, essentially unimpeachable as evidence. If this went the way she believed it would, the data produced in the next several hours would be the most comprehensively documented instance of human cellular repair in the galaxy's scientific record. If it did not go the way she believed it would, the documentation would be of a different kind. She had thought about this. She had thought about it quite carefully. She had also thought about every patient she had ever treated who had come into the emergency department with injuries that the textbook said were unsurvivable, and had then survived them anyway. She had thought about what it meant to have spent 12 years watching the human body do things it was not supposed to be able to do, and then to sit in a lecture hall and be told, gently and precisely, that the records of those events must reflect a definitional error. She climbed onto the procedure table and lay back. "Dr. Vasquez," Kavath said, standing near the monitoring array. "I want to ensure you understand precisely what the procedure involves. Our Category 7 protocol produces tissue damage equivalent to what our models classify as a survivable with intervention wound in Varath physiology, but which our data indicates produces non-recoverable systemic damage in species with less developed cellular repair mechanisms. The damage will be real. It will be significant. Our trauma team is present and prepared to intervene at any point you request." She paused. "I want to also say," her harmonic shifted slightly, "that I do not personally wish harm to come to you. Whatever the outcome of today's demonstration, I hope you understand that." "I know that," Senna said. "That's why I chose your institute." She settled back against the table. "I'm ready when you are." The Varath used a precise energy instrument for their Category 7 protocol, a focused delivery system that produced the specific pattern of cellular disruption their models used as a standardized test case. It was, she had been assured, the most controlled and reproducible method of producing the relevant damage. It was also, she had noted in the pre-procedure briefing, the method their data indicated was the most reliably lethal to non-Varath subjects, without intervention. She appreciated the honesty. The moment the instrument made contact, she understood what they meant by significant. It was not the sharpest pain she had ever felt. Emergency medicine had shown her enough of the body's extremes that she had developed a rough hierarchy of acute physical experience. This was not at the top. What it was thorough. A deep systemic insult that she felt not as a surface sensation, but as something fundamentally interior, the body registering a serious challenge to its fundamental operating parameters. She breathed through it, the way she had learned to breathe through things in the operating theater, steadily and deliberately, because panic accelerated every physiological response in ways that helped nothing. Around her, the monitoring array was already processing data, the soft clicks and hums of the sensors running their analyses. She could hear, at the edge of her perception, the low harmonic murmurs of the Varath researchers watching the early readouts, and she recognized, even through the fog of pain and the deliberate steadiness of her own breathing, that the murmurs had a different quality than she had heard from them before. Not the settled murmur of expected data confirming expected models. Something else. The trauma specialists moved slightly closer. She noted this peripherally. She also noted that they did not activate their intervention equipment. 15 minutes passed. She knew because she had been watching the clock on the wall, the large format display the Varath included in all biological laboratory spaces, because their research had established that subjects in distress benefited from clear temporal information. It was a thoughtful thing to include. She had appreciated it in the pre-procedure materials, and she appreciated it now. At 15 minutes, the primary monitor spoke in Varath harmonic, a formal announcement tone. "Senior researcher Valith, please verify this readout." A pause. "Verified," said another voice. "Director Kaveth, you should see this." The quality of the room changed. It was not a dramatic change, not the kind of thing that would have registered as significant to anyone who didn't spend a lot of time reading rooms for a living. But Senna had spent a lot of time reading rooms for a living, and what she felt in the laboratory in that moment was the specific atmospheric shift that happened when a group of highly trained people encountered data that did not fit their framework and understood simultaneously that the framework was the problem. She had felt it twice before in her career. Once when a patient's tumor had spontaneously reduced without treatment and the oncology team had gathered around the imaging results in near silence for almost a full minute. Once when a colleague had looked at a cardiac readout and said quietly, "That's not possible," and then said, "But there it is." "Dr. Vasquez." Kaveth's voice came from near the monitoring array, and her harmonic had shifted entirely. The precise modulation of established fact replaced by something Senna could only describe as careful. The Varath were almost never careful. They were almost always certain. The cascade failure our models predict has not initiated. She paused. Cellular repair activity is measurable and active across the affected tissue. The pattern is unlike anything in our database, but it is consistent, organized, and appears to be progressing. Senna exhaled, slowly. "Yes," she said. "It usually takes about 20 minutes to get fully established." She kept her voice as level as she could. which was somewhat easier now that the initial phase had passed and her body had shifted from registering the insult to dealing with it. That's normal. For us. Another silence. Valith, Kaveth said, please run the comparative analysis against the human submitted records. A longer pause. The data matches, Valith said, and her harmonic carried something Senna had not heard from a Varath researcher before. Not uncertainty. Something more like the moment after uncertainty resolves into a new kind of knowing. It matches precisely. The recovery curve, the cellular activity patterns, the timeline. The human records are not reflecting a definitional difference. They are reflecting accurate data. Accurate data about a biological process we have no model for. The room was very quiet for a moment. Senna looked at the ceiling, which was the pale blue of Varath laboratory spaces, and thought about every patient she had brought back from the edge of what the chart said was possible, and thought about her medical school professors who had told her class that the human body was the most studied system in the known galaxy and held very few remaining surprises, and almost laughed, because here, 60 light years from the hospital where she had trained, she was lying on an alien table, demonstrating that the most studied system in the known galaxy held surprises that the galaxy had not yet thought to look for. She sat up carefully, the way you sat up after a procedure, checking your own systems before trusting them fully. Everything reported back as expected. The Varath researchers were gathered around the monitoring array in a configuration she had not seen from them before, not the orderly semicircle of observers watching a demonstration, but the loose, close clustering of people who were trying to see something together that none of them fully understood alone. Director Kaveth had not moved from the monitoring array. Her eyes were on the data display, but when Senna sat up, she turned, and for the first time since Senna had arrived at the Institute, the director looked at her with an expression that was not evaluating. That was simply present. "You are not in distress," Kaveth said. It was almost a question. "No," Senna said. "I'm sore. I'll be sore for a few days. But no, I'm not in distress." Kaveth looked at the monitoring array and back at Senna and back at the monitoring array. When she spoke again, her harmonic carried something Senna could only describe as honest. "I have studied biological systems for 60 years, she said. "I have published work that is cited more than any other paper in this institute's history. I have trained 4 generations of researchers. And I have." She stopped. And the stop was the kind that meant what followed was difficult to say, operated throughout that time on the assumption that my models described universal biological law, not patterns, not tendencies. Law. She looked at Senna. "I need to understand what I am looking at, not for the paper, not for the database revision." She paused. "For myself. Because my understanding of what living systems can do has just changed, and I am 60 years into a career built on that understanding, and I need to understand what that means." Senna got off the table carefully and stood. She was, she noted, steadier than she expected. "I can try to explain," she said, "but it might take a while. I have been trying to explain it to myself for 12 years. Kaveth made a gesture that, among Varath, indicated both acknowledgement and the opening of an extended conversation rather than a brief exchange. "We have time," she said. "The Institute's schedule can accommodate this." She looked at the monitoring data one more time. "I think perhaps it will need to." The formal paper came 18 months later, co-authored by Kaveth, Valith, 3 other senior researchers, and Senna, whose name appeared first because Kaveth had insisted on it. The title was precise in the way Varath titles always were, and slightly astonishing in the way Varath titles almost never were. Autonomous Cellular Repair Mechanisms in Homo sapiens, a documented case study and proposed revision to category classification frameworks. The paper was 43 pages long. The appendix was longer than the paper. The appendix was longer than most papers. The Varath Medical Institute's Category 7 classification was revised within 6 months of publication. The revised category included a new sub-classification specifically acknowledging that damage thresholds were species relative and that the previous framework had been built without accounting for species whose evolutionary history had produced qualitatively different repair mechanisms rather than simply faster or slower versions of the same mechanism. In the footnote to that sub-classification, there was a single sentence that Senna had written and that the co-authors had agreed, after some discussion, to keep. The footnote read, "It is worth noting that human subjects have consistently reported the damage described in this study as painful but manageable. Accurate terminology matters." Human applications to the Varath Medical Institute's fellowship program increased 400% in the 2 years following publication. Several of the new applicants cited the paper specifically. Several more cited a secondary source, a long-form piece in the Concordance Medical Review that had summarized the findings for a general audience under the headline, simply, "They were right all along." Senna read that headline and thought, not for the first time, about how much depended on who you asked, and in what room, and whether they were willing to look at what the data actually showed rather than what they expected it to show. The Institute installed a new bench in the 3rd row of the lecture hall that semester. Not because the modified bench had been uncomfortable exactly, but because Varath had commissioned it and had it made to human dimensions and had placed on it a small plaque that read, in both Varath script and standard, "Designed to fit whoever is sitting here." Senna had gone back to look at it before she left for her next posting, 6 months after the paper published. She had sat in it for a while, in the empty lecture hall with its helix ceiling and its preserved specimens and its walls of carefully documented knowledge, and she had thought about everything that got missed when you stopped asking questions because you already knew the answers. And then she had gotten up, picked up her bag, and gone to catch her transport. She had another lecture to attend, and this time she knew she would not be sitting quietly in the 3rd row. The Institute had offered her a position at the lectern. She had thought about it for exactly 1 day before accepting. There were, after all, a great many things left to demonstrate. The revision to the Category 7 framework did not happen quietly. The Varath were not a species given to dramatic institutional gestures, but the retraction and rewriting of a classification that had formed the foundation of their trauma response protocols for 80 years was, by Varath standards, the equivalent of a seismic event. Research centers across the settled galaxy that had adopted the Varath framework sent formal inquiries. 17 papers published in the preceding decade were flagged for methodology review. 4 of them, which had used the Category 7 classification as a baseline for comparative studies of other species, were retracted entirely. The lead author of one of those papers sent Senna a message that was 3 words long. "You were right." She had read it twice and then set her communicator down and looked out the window at the Varath city below the Institute, its careful, precise geometries of glass and cultivated stone, and had felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not triumph, something quieter than that. More like the feeling at the end of a very long surgery, when you'd done everything you could do and the patient was stable, and the only thing left was to close, and you understood that the hardest part wasn't behind you. It was ahead, in the weeks of recovery that nobody ever included in the dramatic retelling. She wrote back, "I know. It doesn't make it easier." She was not sure whether that was comforting or not. She had sent it anyway because it was true. Director Kaveth's relationship with the revised framework was more complicated than a simple acknowledgement of error, and Senna had spent enough time with her over the 18 months of the paper's development to understand why. Kaveth had not merely published work on cellular repair. She had spent 6 decades building the evidential foundation that the rest of the Varath medical community stood on. Her students had become directors of research centers. Her monograph had shaped the questions that 3 generations of researchers had thought to ask, and, more significantly, the questions they had not thought to ask. When the framework was revised, it was not just Kaveth's model that changed. It was the intellectual architecture of an entire discipline. The Varath did not use the word humbling in precisely the way humans used it, but Senna had watched Kaveth sit with the final version of the paper for a long time before signing it, and she thought she recognized the experience regardless of what word either of them would have used to describe it. She had asked, once, during one of the late working sessions that had become a regular feature of the paper's development, whether Kaveth regretted the demonstration. Not the outcome she had specified, the demonstration itself, whether Kaveth wished it had not happened. Kaveth had been quiet for a long time before answering, long enough that Senna had begun to wonder whether the question had been somehow imprecise. Then the director had said in the careful harmonic she, reserved for statements she was still formulating rather than conclusions she had reached. I have spent my career working to understand how living systems function. Today I know something true about living systems that I did not know 60 years ago. She had paused. That is the purpose. That was always the purpose. The rest is what it costs. Senna had written that down in her notes, not because she needed to remember it, but because it felt like the kind of thing that deserved to be written down. She had come to the Institute as a fellow. She was leaving it as something harder to classify, which she had learned to recognize as a sign that something interesting had happened. The position at the lectern was real, confirmed in writing from the Institute's academic board, with the formal harmonic notation the Varath used for appointments rather than consultations. She would return in 4 months, after a posting to a humanitarian mission near the outer systems, and she would begin teaching a seminar on human biology that Kaveth had already described in the course catalogue as essential reading for any researcher working in comparative xenomedicine. The catalogue description had been written by Kaveth herself. Senna had read it 3 times because the language was so uncharacteristic of how the Varath usually described course requirements. The description said, "This seminar will examine documented cases in which human biological systems have produced outcomes inconsistent with prevailing models. Students are expected to approach the material with rigorous attention to the evidence and significant humility regarding the limits of existing frameworks. Prior certainty is not a prerequisite. Prior certainty may, in fact, be a liability." Senna had shown it to Varath, who had read it and made the sound the Varath used for something between amusement and appreciation. Kaveth wrote that herself, Varath said. She argued with the academic board about the last 2 sentences for an hour. They wanted her to soften them. She declined. The morning she left, Senna stopped in the main lecture hall one more time. Not because she had anything left to do there, but because it had been the beginning of the thing. And she had a habit, formed somewhere in the middle years of emergency medicine, of acknowledging endings by returning to beginnings. The hall was empty. The specimens on the walls were as they had always been, preserved and precise. Everything the Varath had catalogued, carefully labeled and carefully understood. She looked at them for a while, all that careful understanding, and thought about what it meant that the most complete biological library in the settled galaxy had not contained until 18 months ago an accurate account of what happened when a human body decided it was not finished yet. Not because the data hadn't been available, because no one had thought the data could be right. She picked up her bag from the modified bench and walked toward the exit. At the door, she paused and looked back at the helix ceiling, which had been built as a tribute to the double strand of life's foundation, the elegant, simple code that produced all the complexity the walls displayed. She thought about her grandfather, who had worked construction for 40 years and had broken his arm twice and his collarbone once, and had never, not once, let any of those injuries keep him away from a job site for more than 3 weeks. And whose doctor had told him on each occasion that his recovery was remarkable. A word that her grandfather had considered unnecessary because, as far as he was concerned, It was just what you did. She thought about her mother, who had survived a vascular event in her early 50s that her cardiologist had classified as almost certainly fatal, and who had gotten up from that and gone back to work in the school where she taught for another 20 years, and who had told Senna, when Senna was in her first year of medical school and frightened of all the things that could go wrong with a human body, that the body knew things the textbooks didn't, that you had to trust it, that it was older than any book. She had not understood then what her mother meant. She thought she understood it a little better now. She went through the door and out into the Varath morning, which was clear and slightly cool and smelled of the resinous compound the Varath used to clean their public spaces, and she walked toward the transit station with the particular gait of someone who had done something hard and knew there was more hard things coming and had decided, somewhere quiet and unannounced in the machinery of herself, that this was acceptable